Pigheads. The beginning of the campaign, our journey began as an adventure that we had long dreamed of. The Appalachians have always attracted me with their wild, unbridled beauty. Mountains covered with endless forests, quiet lakes and streams seemed to harbor secrets that were waiting to be revealed. We decided to go to one of the most remote corners, where a rare tourist dared to go. Our group was small but friendly. Jake, always confident and a little risky, was the leader of our company. His friend Emily is smart and determined, with bright blue eyes that shone with enthusiasm. Tom is quiet and slightly cynical, but you could always rely on him. Lauren, his girlfriend, loved the romance of hiking, the starry sky, campfire songs, morning mist over the lake. And Alex, as always, remained in the role of an observer, preferring to be there and enjoy the moment. We chose a place we had heard about for a long time, a quiet, secluded lake surrounded by dense forests. There were no hiking trails, and the nearest town was about 3 hours away. We knew it would be the perfect place to disconnect from the hustle and bustle. The road to the lake was long but pleasant. We were traveling in 2 cars loaded with tents, backpacks, and food for several days. Music was playing in the background, Jake was humming to the radio, and Emily was laughing at his fake notes. Lauren took out her camera and tried to capture the views outside the window. Mountains covered with autumn colors, and vast fields where the wind stirred the dry grass. When we finally got there, it was too late. The sky had turned a rich orange hue, and the sun was starting to set behind the mountains. We set up camp quickly. Jake took care of the tents, Tom laid out the equipment, and Lauren built a fire. Emily and I went to get some firewood, discussing plans for the next few days. When darkness covered the forest, the camp was already alive. The campfire crackled, the tents stood perfectly straight, and the dinner of canned food and baked bread seemed like a holiday to us. No one knew yet that this was where our nightmare would begin. The story of the campfire. When the camp was set up and dinner was eaten, Jake, as usual, decided to add a little intrigue to our evening. He was sitting by the fire, throwing branches on the fire, and his face looked ominous in the dancing light of the flames. We settled around the campfire. Tom was sitting cross-legged, looking gloomy. Lauren was clinging to his shoulder, as if she already had a premonition of something bad. Emily settled down next to me, her eyes glowing in the firelight. It was quiet around us, except for the occasional rustle of leaves and the crackle of branches. "How about a scary story?" asked Jake, grinning. Lauren rolled her eyes, but her voice sounded uncertain. "Of course. That's so. By the way, all this forest, the darkness." "Come on, Lauren. They're just stories." Tom interrupted her, but his voice sounded strained. Jake leaned forward, his face looking scary, illuminated from below by the flames of the campfire. He lowered his voice, and his words sounded like an ominous whisper. "Have you heard about pigheads?" Emily frowned. "What?" Jake grinned, but there was something strange in his eyes, as if he himself believed what he was going to tell. "It's a local legend, but some say it's not just fairy tales," he began, and his voice became slow, mesmerizing. "They say that here, in these forests, there are creatures that once were people. No one knows exactly where they came from. Some say that these are military experiments, others that this is a curse that has fallen on this earth. They are called pig-headed because their bodies are half human and their heads are pig-like. But these are not just animals. These creatures can speak, and their voices are similar to human ones, sometimes even deceptively familiar." We all froze. The forest around us seemed to become even quieter, as if the trees were also listening. "The scariest thing about them is the way they hunt," Jake continued. "They don't attack right away. They wait until the victim is alone. They can speak human language. Sometimes they call for help, imitate screams. You can hear someone shouting, 'Help! Help!' and to believe that someone is in trouble. But it will be a trap. As soon as you get closer, they will jump out of the shadows, and it will be too late to do anything." Lauren squeezed Tom's hand. Her face turned pale. "It sounds terrible," she whispered. "They don't just kill," Jake said, his voice even quieter, almost a whisper. "They're playing with their victims. Sometimes you can hear them laughing, talking to each other, exchanging phrases like people. But this is not laughter, but something creepy, disgusting. They can chase you for hours, driving you crazy, and then attack you when you're too tired to run." Emily swallowed, and her eyes flashed with fear. "Jake, you're making this up, aren't you?" "Maybe," he replied, but his voice sounded unconvincing. "You know, the locals say that a few years ago, tourists disappeared somewhere in this area. Only their belongings and tents were found, but the bodies were never found. Truth or fiction? Who knows?" I felt a chill run down my spine. The forest around us, which had seemed beautiful and welcoming during the day, now looked gloomy and menacing. The shadows of the trees, illuminated by the fire, seemed to be moving figures. "Why are they called pigheads?" Lauren suddenly asked, her voice trembling. Jake looked at her intently. "Because their heads really look like pigs, huge, covered with stubble, with long yellow fangs. And their eyes like people's, full of hate and pain. It is said that when they attack, they do not just kill, but enjoy it. They tear their victim apart, leaving only bloody shreds." Lauren flinched, and Tom shot Jake an annoyed look. "Okay, that's enough. We're not here to scare the girls." But no one else spoke. We just sat there, looking at the dying fire, and inside each of us there was a growing feeling that Jake had told more than just a horror story. His words echoed in the silence of the forest. They could be anywhere, in the dark, behind the trees, just waiting for you to make a mistake. Silence of the forest. After Jake's story, silence hung in the air, as if nature itself had decided to freeze in fear. The forest around us was dark, as if the light of the campfire was swallowed up by bottomless darkness. Even the familiar sounds of crickets and night birds have disappeared, leaving us in an eerie, almost deathly silence. Lauren was sitting with her arms wrapped around her knees, her eyes wide open, and her face resembled the frightened face of a child. "Why is it so quiet here?" she whispered, looking around. "It's just a coincidence," Tom said, trying to hide his excitement. "The forest sometimes quiets down at night." But I noticed how his hands were shaking as he reached for the water bottle. Emily was sitting next to me, her shoulders tensed. She hardly moved, only her eyes were constantly running from the campfire to the surrounding forest. I knew she didn't like stories like that, and right now she was ready to get mad at Jake for making things even more creepy. Jake himself looked pleased, but his smile was more like a mask. He knew his story had an effect, but he seemed a little worried himself. "Well, okay, it's just a story," he finally said, breaking the silence. "Don't take it seriously. There are no pigheads here." "You know this isn't funny, right?" Emily said sharply, turning to him. Her voice sounded louder than necessary, as if she was trying to fill this strange silence around us. But none of us could ignore the fact that the forest had indeed become strangely quiet. Usually at night, sounds can be heard in the forest, The rustle of the wind, the rustle of animals, the creaking of trees. But now it's all gone, as if we were in a vacuum. I guess the animals just sensed us, Tom muttered softly, as if trying to convince not only us, but also himself. The fire crackled, breaking the tense silence. Lauren flinched and panic flashed in her eyes. "We have to go home tomorrow morning. I don't want to stay here," she said. "Lauren, calm down. It's just a story." Jake waved it off, but there was a note of irritation in his voice. I decided to support her. "If you're uncomfortable, we can break camp tomorrow. But let's just calm down now. It's just the night." These words should have sounded reassuring, but even I didn't believe them myself. There was something about that night that told me it wasn't just a coincidence. The forest seemed to be watching us, silently but relentlessly. And at that moment, I heard it. A barely discernible sound, like a whisper. Quiet, almost invisible to the ear, but it made its way to me like a cold wind rolling along my spine. "Help!" I froze. The forest around us remained motionless, but this sound sounded clearly, as if someone was standing just a few meters away from us. Emily noticed that I was tense and asked quietly, "Did you hear that?" Lauren, as if sensing our fear, asked in a frightened voice, "What?" I shook my head, trying to dismiss it, but Jake suddenly raised his hand, telling us to be quiet. "Help!" The sound was repeated, but this time a little louder. We all froze, our eyes met, and I saw in them what I felt myself. Fear growing in my stomach like a cold lump. "Someone is calling for help," Emily whispered. Her voice was trembling. "It's just the wind," Tom said, but his voice was devoid of the old sarcasm. Lauren snorted, her voice shaking with panic. "It sounds like a voice." Jake stood up. "Someone might be in trouble. We can't just sit here." "No," Emily almost shouted, grabbing his arm. "You're not going there. It could be—" She didn't finish, but I knew what she was thinking. The same thing I thought. A call from the darkness. Jake finally pulled his hand out of Emily's grasp, his face a mixture of annoyance and determination. "Well, what do you suggest? Just sit here and hope it was the wind?" His voice sounded louder than necessary, and its echo echoed in the complete silence of the night. Emily jumped to her feet. "Did you even hear what you just said? What if it's them? These pigheads?" Her voice trembled, and I could see tears of fear glistening in her eyes. Tom got up and stood between them. "Okay, that's enough. We can't just break into the woods in the middle of the night because of some voice. Even if it's a human, we don't know what awaits us there." "Tom is right," Lauren said, snuggling up to him. Her hands were shaking, but she was trying to look brave. "Maybe it's someone who's playing a prank on us." Jake chuckled, but his voice didn't sound as confident as before. He looked at me as if seeking support. "I don't know, Jake," I said, feeling a chill creep up my spine. "It's weird, but going there doesn't seem like the best idea." Suddenly, the voice rang out again, but this time closer, and it was louder, full of despair. "Help! You are welcome. Someone." This cry was so human that it was impossible to ignore. We all froze, looking at each other. "It's definitely a man," Jake said, and his voice sounded firm even though I could see his hands shaking. "I can't just sit here. If it's someone who needs help and we don't do anything, then it will be on our conscience." Emily screamed, grabbing his jacket. "You've heard your story. What if it's them? You said they can imitate a human voice." But Jake had already picked up the lantern and headed towards the forest. "Is anyone coming with me?" he asked, turning around. I felt the weight of his gaze and forced myself to stand up. "I'm going to go, but just the two of us." "You're crazy," Lauren exclaimed, her voice almost hysterical. "This is wrong." "It may be late in the morning," Jake said firmly, and began to move into the darkness. I turned around for a moment. Lauren was crying, clinging to Tom, and Emily was looking at me with despair and anger in her eyes. "Be careful," Tom muttered, but his voice was full of doubt. Jake and I stepped into the darkness, leaving the campfire behind. The beginning of the horror. We walked slowly, carefully, looking back at every sound. Our lanterns picked out a dense thicket of trees covered with moss and cobwebs from the darkness. Shadows danced from the light, turning into bizarre, sinister figures. With each step, the forest around us became more suffocating, as if the air itself was being compressed, preventing us from breathing. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" I muttered, trying to speak in a whisper so as not to break the frightening silence. Jake stopped and looked back at me, and I saw a strange mixture of confidence and fear in his eyes. "I do not know, Alex, but if it's someone who's really in trouble, and we're just sitting there doing nothing." He paused before he finished his sentence, but I didn't need to hear the rest. Suddenly, we heard the voice again. He was even closer, shrill and full of despair. "Help! Please help me!" My hair stood on end. The voice sounded like someone was crying and calling for help at the same time. "It's from there," Jake said, pointing the flashlight away. We moved on, carefully, trying not to step on dry branches so as not to make any sounds. The forest around us seemed somehow wrong. The trees grew taller and thicker, their gnarled branches interlacing like claws ready to grab us. I noticed how the ground changed under my feet. The grass disappeared, leaving only bare, cracked soil, as if this section of the forest had been dead for a long time. Suddenly, Jake froze, raising his hand to stop me. He pointed the flashlight forward, and I saw something that made me go cold. There was a puddle of red color on the ground. It was fresh, shiny in the light of the lantern. We realized with horror what it was. A torn backpack was lying nearby. "This is bad," I whispered, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. Jake didn't answer. He bent down and examined the backpack. There were clothes and a broken water bottle inside, but no trace of the owner. And then we heard it, a quiet, barely discernible rustle. I turned around, holding the lantern with a trembling hand, but there was nothing around us, only emptiness and darkness. "Did you hear that?" I asked, trying not to panic. "Yes," Jake whispered, his voice trembling. Suddenly, the voice rang out again, but now it sounded completely different. It was intermittent, as if the man was suffocating. "Help me, please, ... And then I realized that the voice sounded wrong. It was as if someone was trying to imitate a person, but did not fully understand how to do it. "Jake, he's not human," I whispered, but my voice sounded too loud in the silence. Before he could answer, a figure emerged from the darkness. I couldn't see her right away, but what I saw made me step back. It was something huge, a head covered with stubble, with a long pig's snout and eyes that glowed yellow in the light of our lanterns. The body was partially human, but the legs and arms seemed twisted, as if they had been repeatedly broken and spliced again. It looked at us with its head tilted as if studying us, and then opened its mouth and let out a low, eerie wheeze. I felt my legs go limp and my hands tremble. "Let's run," I breathed, not taking my eyes off the creature. "No, wait," Jake began, but he didn't have time to finish. The creature lunged forward, hunting. I wasn't waiting for the command. As soon as this monster rushed towards us, I turned and ran. Jake ran after me, his flashlight shaking in his hands, illuminating only the flashing roots of trees and pieces of cracked earth. There were loud stomping and wheezing sounds from behind. The creature was chasing us, and every step it took was a blow to the ground, like an approaching landslide. My lungs burned, but fear drove me forward. The forest seemed to come to life. Shadows flickered around, and branches grabbed our arms and legs, as if the trees themselves were trying to stop us. Jake shouted, and I swerved sharply, almost crashing into a huge tree. We made our way through a dense thicket, where the light of the lanterns did not penetrate the darkness, and the sounds of our running echoed through the forest. The creature suddenly let out a deafening roar, so low and deep that I felt a vibration pass through the ground. I looked back for a moment and saw his huge figure rushing after us, jumping over bushes and driftwood with superhuman ease. Jake stopped abruptly, grabbing my shoulder. "Over there!" he shouted, pointing to some kind of dilapidated wooden shed that suddenly appeared in front of us among the trees. We rushed inside, slammed the door, and leaned on her, pinning her down with our bodies. "What was that?" I gasped, panting. My heart was beating so fast that it seemed like it was about to jump out of my chest. Jake didn't answer. His face was pale, and his eyes stared at nothing. He gasped for air, trying to come to his senses. There was a crunching of branches outside. The creature was nearby. We could hear his heavy breathing, as if he was deliberately slowing down, playing with us. "It's here," Jake whispered, his voice trembling. The door suddenly cracked from a strong impact. The two of us leaned on her, trying to hold her down, but the strength was incredible. The creature struck again, and one of the boards began to crack. Pieces of wood fell to the floor. I grabbed a wooden stick that was lying nearby and picked it up, as if it could help in some way. Jake tried to find something to block the door, but there was almost no time left. Silence. The blows stopped. We looked at each other, not understanding what was going on. Suddenly, through a crack in the door, I saw his eyes. Yellow, glowing in the dark. They were too close, and I felt goosebumps all over my body. The creature was making a strange, intermittent sound, like laughter. And then, from somewhere in the forest, a familiar voice was heard. "Guys, it's me, Tom. Open up." My heart sank. It was his voice, his intonation. I shouted, clutching at the door. Jake looked at me, his face full of doubt. "Are you sure? It could be him. You said it yourself. They're imitating voices." The voice outside became pleading. "Guys, please. I'm hurt. They're after me." I felt cold sweat trickling down my back. The creature continued to stand motionless, outside the door, watching. It was playing with us. "Flush. Don't open it," I shouted, clutching the stick so that my knuckles turned white. But Jake was already moving toward the door. His face expressed a mixture of despair and hope. "If it's Tom, we can't leave him," he shouted, grabbing the door handle. I grabbed his shoulder, but he was already pulling the door open. When the door opened a crack, there was an empty space in front of us. No Tom, just a dark forest and silence. "Where is he?" whispered Jake, stepping forward, illuminating the space in front of the barn with a flashlight. And then it happened. Out of the darkness, something rushed forward with superhuman speed. A huge figure, blurred in the light of the lantern, crashed into Jake, and he fell with a muffled cry. His flashlight fell to the floor, illuminating the chaotically moving shadows. I shouted, rushing towards him, but my movement was interrupted by a terrible roar. I saw the creature looming over Jake, pinning him down with a massive paw. His head was even scarier up close, a long, curved snout covered with stubble, huge fangs dripping with saliva. The eyes, filled with malice and something almost human, stared straight at me. "Help!" Jake croaked, his voice full of pain. I grabbed a stick that was lying nearby and hit it with all my might on the creature. The sound of the blow reverberated in my hands, but the creature didn't even flinch. It just turned its head in my direction, and in its eyes I saw something terrible, conscious gloating. A second later, the creature tore Jake apart. His scream stopped so abruptly that the silence that followed hit his ears. Blood splattered on the walls and on me, and I felt something in my mind break. I don't remember running out of the barn. My legs carried me on their own until I found myself back in the forest. I ran without looking back, hearing the patter of paws and heavy breathing behind me, as if the forest monster itself was chasing me. I stopped only when I saw the glimmer of light from the campfire. Lauren, Tom, and Emily were still sitting outside the camp. When they saw me, they jumped to their feet. "Where's Jake?" Emily exclaimed, rushing to me. He... I couldn't get it out. My body was shaking, and the blood on my clothes spoke for itself. Lauren screamed, her face turning pale. But before I could answer, a voice came from the forest. "Hey, it's me, Jake. It's okay." We all froze. The voice was familiar, but I knew the truth. Jake was gone. Emily took a step back, her hands shaking. "This can't be." Tom looked like he was about to lose consciousness. Lauren started crying, covering her face with her hands. "We can't stay here," I finally said. "We need to leave." And then the voice came again, but closer now. "Where are you going?" "It's me," an invisible horror. We stood around the fire, unable to move. The forest, dark and menacing, surrounded us like a locked cage. Jake's voice continued to sound, this time from the depths of the trees. "Guys, don't be afraid. I'm fine." Emily grabbed my hand, her eyes glistening with tears. "Alex, it's him, isn't it?" she whispered, but her voice sounded like she was trying to convince herself. Not me. I shook my head, trying to keep from shaking. "No, it's not him," Lauren asked, her voice shaking like a dry leaf in the wind. "Pigheads," I whispered, looking at the dark wall of the forest. "They imitate." "This is crazy," Tom said, his voice sounding annoyed, but there was fear in his eyes. He got to his feet and walked to the edge of the camp. "Jake, if it's you, come out," I shouted, but he ignored me and took a few more steps into the darkness. Lauren screamed, but he was already moving forward, lighting the way with a flashlight. And then it happened. The voice came from the forest again, but now it was broken, distorted, as if someone was trying to speak, but did not know how to speak correctly. "Tom, I'm here. Help me." Tom stopped, his hand with the lantern dropped. I saw him listening intently, and then something emerged from the darkness. It was quick as a flash. I didn't have time to see the details, only the silhouette, huge, with curved limbs, black stubble covering the body, and a pig's head that seemed too big for this creature. It hit Tom with such force that he didn't even have time to scream. His lantern flew out of his hands, fell to the ground, and illuminated the scene. The creature lifted him up on its clawed hands like a rag doll. Tom screamed, but his scream was cut short by a hideous crunch as the creature sank its fangs into his neck. Lauren screamed, closing her eyes, and Emily clung to me, her body trembling with terror. I grabbed a stick lying by the fire and rushed forward, but the creature threw Tom's dead body to the ground, turned to me and let out a roar that chilled to the bone. I shouted, turning to the girls. We ran, leaving the campfire and camp behind. Lauren was crying, her sobs mingling with our raucous sighs. There were sounds all around us, footsteps, cracking branches, rustling, as if something was moving parallel to us, hiding in the shadows. Emily stumbled, and I managed to grab her arm before she fell. I shouted, pulling her forward. But their footsteps were already coming out of the darkness. They drove us like a herd, playing with us, pulling our strength. Escape by dawn, we ran without feeling our legs. The wind was in our faces, cold and merciless, and the very embodiment of horror was rushing behind us. The branches of the trees whipped at their faces, the air felt viscous like syrup, and every breath was difficult. Lauren screamed, looking over her shoulder. Her voice was trembling, and there was panic in it, bordering on madness. I looked back for a moment and saw them. 3 creatures moving on all fours, with pig heads covered with thick black stubble. Their eyes glowed like hell torches, and their mouths were open, exposing sharp fangs. They made sounds like hoarse laughter that seemed to fill the entire forest. I shouted, pulling Emily up, who was starting to lag behind. Lauren was in front, but her movements were becoming more and more uncertain. And suddenly, she stumbled. I saw her legs give way, and she fell to the ground with a loud cry. Emily screamed, taking a step back, but I grabbed her arm. "No, we can't," I shouted, knowing that Lauren's help would mean our doom. Lauren looked up, her eyes filled with horror. "Please don't leave me." The creatures were already nearby. One of them leaped at her, its huge claws digging into her back, and its mouth with sharp fangs dug into her neck. Her scream was short, but so terrible that I wanted to cover my ears. Emily started crying, but I made her keep running. "This way! Hurry up!" The forest was getting denser, but I saw glimpses of light ahead. We raced with all our might until another scream pierced the air. Emily stopped, clutching at a tree. They've got you!" she screamed, looking at me. I turned around to see what she meant, but at that moment one of the creatures jumped at her from behind. She screamed, her body collapsed to the ground, and I saw the monster's mouth sink into her shoulder. I screamed, but she was already disappearing under the body of the creature that was tearing her apart. I was left alone. Tears were streaming down my cheeks, and I didn't remember moving on. The forest was an endless maze of darkness, but ahead I could see light, faint but real. Sunrise. The footsteps and wheezing behind me did not stop. I knew they were still here, stalking me, waiting for me to stop. I broke out into the open road where the morning light spread over the ground. I saw the headlights of a truck ahead. The car stopped and a man got out of the cab. "What happened?" "Hey, are you okay?" he asked, but his voice sounded like it was in a fog. I fell to my knees, gasping for breath. The forest froze behind me. When I looked up, the man helped me up. I saw his frightened eyes. "Are you hurt?" he asked. They're there," I gasped. The man looked back at the forest. The tree line looked serene, as if nothing had happened. I knew that only the morning had saved me.